This is TWiT.
The dream was universal access to knowledge. The result was a fiasco from the New York Times. We're talking about Brewster Kahle's emergency library. He got sued by publishers. Now Brewster Kahle is, the Internet Archive is being sued by the record labels because he also asked people to donate their 78s, digitized them, and offered them. I think, there's clearly a societal interest in having an Internet Archive and preserving our history when companies don't care, whether it's game ROMs or old movies or books or, well, I can go on and on, websites. But at the same time, and I remember asking Brewster this, what about copyright? Aren't you in trouble? He said, we'll worry about that later. His attitude, I guess, at this point is we're a library. Libraries don't worry about copyright. You are a published author. Both of you are published authors. So you maybe have a dog in this hunt. I guess, Cory, you allow digital copies of all your books. They're online.
Most of them. My publishers haven't allowed me for a couple of books. I have to say, Leo, I work for Electronic Frontier Foundation. We are of counsel to the Internet Archive. So there's actually very little I can say about this without first talking to our legal director. But I can say, I think Brewster is good.
Yes.
And I think the Internet Archive is good. And I think that the factual record about the National Emergency Library is thin, and that what we know about it doesn't support the story that a lot of writers have been told about it. So here's the thing that I think has been poorly understood about the Internet Archive, is that after the Patriot Act passed, when the librarians sued over the Patriot Act and the thought that they were going to be forced to give up their patron records, Brewster went into the Internet Archive and ripped out everything that would tell him what people were accessing on the Internet Archive so that no one could ever make him give it to anyone else because he respects his patron privacy. And after the National Emergency Library kicked off, he just didn't have a lot of good usage statistics. But once he started finding ways to build aggregated statistics that would allow him to help people understand what the impact of the National Emergency Library was, and more broadly of the lending library that the archive operates, it became pretty clear that what was going on here is that people were using this the way that you might use a reference library, that the average checkout was for a few minutes, and it was to look at a couple of pages, looking up a quote, looking up a passage, looking up a recipe, looking up some technical information, trying to find the name of something, and putting it back. And there was a lot of concern that this might be eroding the sales of books during lockdown. And I don't think the factual record supports it. And I hope that my colleagues in the writing profession understand that and understand that the Internet Archive is a library. It was used like a library. However you feel about whatever liberties you think Brewster took during the brief period in which the National Emergency Library was operating, the record doesn't support the story about how that might have affected our economic fortunes, and that is no longer operative. And so there's a much more conservative version of it operating that looks effectively identical to the library at the digital lending program at your local library, which I hope no writer objects to.
Yeah. Well, I think you've written, I know others have, that what the publishers would really like is to get rid of libraries. That's the
and Rebecca might have some views because she is a law professor who supports libraries. So she can talk about it much more freely.
She's also an author, so she might also have some a stake in this.
Yeah, look, there is a maxim in law that says hard cases make bad law. And I think it's really important to remember the circumstances in which this was happening. Do we all remember how insane it was in those early days of 2020? Nobody knew what was going on. I know that a lot of our students suddenly didn't have access to books anymore. We have very restrictive access for ebooks, and that's something that I've worked on for many years. People don't necessarily know this, but the way that libraries have always been able to lend physical books is without anybody's permission. But when it comes to ebooks, that involves making copies and transmissions, which means copyright gets involved, and you do have to get permission. And that's all well and good. Authors and publishers should be remunerated appropriately for uses of their books. But a lot of publishers have responded to the fact that they can control ebooks by saying, well, we don't think that you should be able to hold these in libraries at all. So Hachette, for example, it does license its books to public libraries in North America for e-lending, but it won't allow any libraries in the Commonwealth to lend those on any circumstances at all, right? And there's other things too. You know, we see publishers saying, okay, you can license these books, but we're going to charge you more money, and they're going to wear out. They're going to wear out after 26 loans, and then you're going to, have to buy a new one. So there's all of these things are happening in the background. And so that those policies can make it really difficult. We also see it was really common as well to have a bundling where you had to buy like 1,000 terrible books that you didn't want in order to get the one book that you did want if you were a library. And so all of that's happening in the background, and suddenly people are not able to get to the university library and access those physical copies anymore. And the policies might have been somewhat different in North America, but we still had that same kind of that sudden shift. And it was really important to respond to that. And I think that probably people might have forgotten those circumstances and just how difficult it was. And I also believe that Brewster is trying very, very hard to do good, and that he's quite devastated, I think, by the way that this went, and everybody was doing their own thing. But I think that the most important thing we should turn our mind to right now is thinking about, well, how do we make sure that we have got sensible, appropriate e-lending policies so that publishers and authors are looked after, but libraries have also got the right to be able to lend books. And that's really, really important because libraries are the ones that preserve them. Often it's publishers that will go to the Internet Archive and go, actually, can we get a copy of this? Because we forgot to keep it ourselves. And we need to have people and organizations whose role it is to preserve, because that's not the case for everybody's role.
Rebecca, you should talk about your authorship project and the libraries you work with in Australia, because it's such an inspiring story.
Well, do you mean Untapped, Cory?
Yeah, Rebecca has far more books that came out of the pandemic than I did.
Yeah. So wow. Cory only published 8. Yeah. I published 161 on a single day, plus choke point capitalism. Well, so remember I was just saying, do we remember how crazy it was in those early days of the pandemic? Some of the things that I did to survive being locked in my apartment for 2 years was 1, write a book with Cory Doctorow. 2, start a publishing house that is called Untapped. It's the Australian Literary Heritage Project. And we did this as an experiment, basically. This was in part my response to the fact that libraries were struggling so much to be able to access books. And Amazon has been whispering in publishers' ears that they should not allow libraries to lend out their ebooks, and saying that it was cannibalizing their businesses. Now, one of the problems with that is that there's no public data that shows that is the case, and the data that does exist through the e-lending aggregators that sit between libraries and users suggests it's not the case. Amazon is the one that controls the data that says that it would allow us to figure out whether this was actually happening, but it's a notoriously secretive company, and it refused to make that information public. And so I really wanted to know, is library e-lending of books cannibalizing book sales? Because if it is, we need to know that. We all need libraries and publishers and authors and readers.
Guys, I'm going to get under my desk because there's an earthquake.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Oh my gosh. We're gonna keep on, Cory. Let's watch the earthquake happen as it unrolls. I think you're all right, Cory.
I'm definitely going to stop talking about my thing.
He's not going to be safer under the desk. I just want to point out there's quite a few books in there. I hope those bookshelves are strapped down. I think he's going to be all right. It could be related to Hurricane Hillary. Who knows? So you're a law professor. So let me help me understand, because what it seems to be is an eternal conflict between the interests of society and the interest of property holders, right? In this, that is a constant tension. So in this case, writers and publishers who've created content want to control that content and make sure that they get paid for people to read it. Society has absolutely an interest in public libraries. I think we can agree on that, even if publishers and Amazon might not. But those are intention. Are you saying that if we can prove that it's not costing publishers that much money to have digital rights, that it'll be okay? Or is it really that the property owners don't ultimately want you to have them at all without buying it?
No, look, what I really want to draw attention to, Leo, is not this idea that there is it's a tension between publishers and the authors on one hand and society on the other, but even authors with publishers. Like, most of America's and Australia's literary heritage is out of print and lost forever. Right. Nearly every book is out of print and we don't have copies of them anymore. The only places we're going to find those copies are in libraries, and preservation libraries in particular. And so what really inspired this project is when we realized that, well, we can't get this data because Amazon controls the sales data for ebooks, and libraries have the lending data, but that's all siloed. Well, we thought, well, what if we start and what if we start our own publishing house, and then we figure out what's going on? And so what we did is we found 161 really culturally important Australian books, and we worked with the authors to help them get their rights back. These are all books that were still in copyright. They were, some of them, half a dozen of them were winners of our most prestigious literary prize, the Miles Franklin. And on top of that, we had amazing books by First Nations writers, women writers, really important like local stories, lots of other prize winners as well, all of it lost. And we worked with those authors to help them get their rights back from the publishers and then to republish these books. And so
how hard was it to pry these away from the publishers? Clearly the publishers aren't publishing these books anymore. They're out of print. Was it as easy as saying, well, you don't want this, do you? Can we buy it for $1?
Well, sometimes the publishers were really happy to give them back. Publishers are book people as well, right? And this is one of the reasons why I find a lot of these debates just really frustrating, because we're all book people. Sure. We all ultimately want the same thing, and we've got different ideas about how we might do it. Right. And I mean, ultimately, the big problem is there is not enough money, right? So we get distracted fighting over scraps, fighting over whether the internet, the National Emergency Library is taking away some of those scraps from authors and publishers, when we should be like asking the much bigger question of where is the money, and do we actually want people to be able to write books and people to be able to read books? And if we want people to be able to write books and people to be able to read books, we need to find money for books, and that's all there is to it. And if we found more money, then there would be a lot less fighting over scraps.
The problem is,
but yes, it was.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It was quite tricky, but not because the publishers didn't necessarily want to give us the rights. In most cases, they were really happy to, but because it was really hard to figure out who even owned those rights.
Sure.
Often the publishers had been acquired 3 or 4 times. In one case, we asked every single publisher that was plausible, and they were just like, well, we really don't think we own it. We'll give you a letter saying if we own it, you can have it back, but we don't know that we do. Sometimes the contract, and this is like, we're talking about, copyrights can last 100 years, and publishers take the rights for the entire time, right? Regardless of whether they are going to need them for that whole time, because they think maybe this time is going to be the one that is, the Harry Potter or the whatever that goes really huge. But other times they had lost the contracts and the author didn't have the contract either. Sometimes the contracts had been lost in a flood. Other times they really did play hardball and they wanted to insist that they had the rights. And then we had to try and interpret what a contract written 50 years ago meant today with the very different technologies that we lived in. So it was hard to get the rights, but not for the reasons that you might expect.
Well, it's interesting too, because you have the 3 stakeholders, libraries, authors, and publishers, who are all book people, but you've added a 4th stakeholder who is clearly not a book person, which is the choke point, Amazon. And and they have very different incentives than the first 3.
So I think you're getting onto something important there, Leo, because one thing that I think we lose sight of when we talk about books and copyright is that not only are books older than copyright, they're like older than printing, They're older than the codex form, right? They're older than binding.
Yeah.
They're older than commerce. And there is a kind of penumbra of virtue that surrounds books. I mean, there's a reason, apart from the fact that I just own a lot of books. In fact, it's the same reason that I own a lot of books and that I appear in front of a lot of books, and that anytime someone wants to show themselves being learned, they stand in front of books. And if you're making a hacky student film and you want to show that society has collapsed, you light a bunch of books on fire and everyone knows exactly what it means. Easier than simulating like roasting a dog, which would be the only other way you could show how far civilization had fallen. And I think for book people in general, there is this sense that there is something quite special about books that goes beyond the vegetable matter sprayed with ink. And that the drive to turn books into a commodity, I mean, they are a commodity, right? But to strip them of all the non-commodity elements and to make them into just a widget, to make them into like something that is has the same shrink wrap license as an old CD-ROM might, will turn them into something that has the cultural cachet of a CD-ROM, which is to say none, right? When was the last time you had a CD-ROM?
Right.
Like there is this danger that we will someday convince people that the entire contract that relates to how you and your book should get along is contained in like, you know, a 50,000 word garbage legalese novella that you have to click I agree to, and that all the unspoken cultural stuff is just not important. And if we actually convince people of this, which we might, it will be a really bad day for writing and book selling and publishing economically, right? Like we buy books for kind of like social and cultural reasons that are not the reason that we buy granola bars. And if we turn books into granola bars that you read, it will be to the great detriment of the publishing industry. And Amazon really wants a book to be an ASIN, right? Just a SKU, just a like a 9-digit alphanumeric that is like sequentially between a plumbing fitting and a Chinese sex toy with dangerous contaminants in its plastic.
You know, we've come full circle because this was the same observation Dana Boyd had about MySpace, which wasn't the individual contributions on MySpace, it was the connections. What makes a book important as opposed to a granola bar is the conversation that the author is having with its readers, with her readers. And it is the connections that make the difference.
Hey folks, I'm Ant Pruitt and I have a question for you. How do you think your hardworking team, with a Club TWiT corporate subscription plan, of course, show your appreciation and reward your tech team with a subscription to Club TWiT? Keep everyone informed and entertained with podcasts covering the latest in tech. With the Club TWiT subscription, they get access to all of our podcasts ad-free, and they also get access to our members-only Discord, access to exclusive outtakes and behind-the-scenes footage and special content like the fireside chats that I enjoy hosting. Plus, they also get shows like Hands on Mac, Hands on Windows, and the Untitled Linux Show. So, go to twit.tv/clubtwit and look for corporate plans for complete details.